Hello, my name is Dr. Kurt Sander, and this is Music Theory Simplified. Have you ever felt that music sometimes takes you on a journey? As if it's grabbing you by the hand and saying, let's go here or let's go there? If you've ever felt that way, there's a reason for it. The things that we experience in music are all drawn from how we hear the relationships between pitches, whether they're vertical or horizontal. And it also has to do with how we hear musical events unfold over time. And how these musical events pull us in various directions is a question that a lot of theorists have hoped to answer. Today we're going to be looking at this phenomenon in music, about how we're pulled in various directions. It's something that's very specific to Western styles of music. Up until now, we've been looking primarily at what we call diatonic harmony. Now, that word diatonic simply means across the tonic. But have you ever wondered why there are certain accidentals, sharps or flats or natural signs in a particular key that don't seem to quite belong there? You might think, well, they're just passing tones, neighbor tones, that kind of thing. They're just ornamental in nature. But I'm here to tell you that's not always the case. In fact, it's less often the case. In most cases, they actually are serving a function. And that function we're going to look at today. Today we're going to focus all on those things that we call in music secondary dominants. But before we get into those, let me start with a story. It's about that great composer named George Frederick Handel. Yeah, he's the one that composed the Messiah. And actually, the story takes place during the composition of the Messiah. Now, I'm not sure if this story is true or not. I've been told it and it's kind of been passed along, but let's say it is. When Handel was composing the Messiah, he composed it in a very short amount of time. And if you know the Messiah, it's a very long piece. Well, he had obligations. He had deadlines, just like we all do. And his housekeeper knew that, because if Handel didn't get paid, she wouldn't be paid. And so it was that Handel was composing well into the night. And in the mornings, he would sleep in, just because he was so exhausted. So the housekeeper tried everything to wake him up, and nothing seemed to work. So she had an idea one morning. She went down to the harpsichord, because the pianos were not invented yet, went down to the harpsichord and played this progression. Take a listen. So you can imagine how Handel must have reacted to that. So then Handel came rushing down and in a fit of anger resolved the progression. So what was this thing that got Handel out of bed? It's something we call in music tendency tones. A tendency tone is simply a note that wants to pull you somewhere. And this pulling motion is found most often in the 5-7-1, where you have scale degree 4 moving by half step to 3, and the leading tone, scale degree 7, moving up to the first scale degree, or the home note. So this unfinished progression that got Handel out of bed employs this leading tone motion, and also uses the 4th scale degree moving down to the 3rd scale degree. And these two notes combined create a dissonant interval of the tritone that needs resolution. So the main takeaway here is that the dominant chord, because of that leading tone, sets up expectations. You want to hear 7 resolving to 1. But the dominant 7th chord sets up even stronger expectations because it also uses the 4 to 3 scale degree motion to create that tritone that we just saw. So the inherent power of the 5 chord and the 5-7 chord, the dominant and the dominant 7th, carries with it an ability to tonicize. Now that word tonicization is a very important word. A fancy definition of tonicization is to lend tonal weight to another diatonic chord. But what does that mean, to lend tonal weight? Well, think of it this way. It's to make some other chord sound like a temporary tonic. But how do we make a chord sound like a temporary tonic? Well, we use the tendency tones of the tonicized chord through the use of its own 5 or 5/7. Let me show you an example. Here we have a regular 5/7-1 in C major, and you can see the familiar 4-3 and 7-1 tendency tones. But if we wanted to tonicize some other chord in that key, say the G major chord, we would have to use the tendency tones of G major, the F sharp, and the C. Here we're tonicizing the 4 chord, F major, with the leading tone E and the 4th scale degree, B flat. You'll notice that each of these examples there's some sort of chromatic alteration. This is a handy table that shows you what the diatonic counterpart is of that chord, in other words, the scale degree it's built on, and the chromatic alteration. So a 5/7 of 5 would be built on the 2nd scale degree but have a sharp 4 alteration. The 5/7 of 2 is built on the 6th scale degree but has a raised 1st scale degree alteration. In minor, we also find these alterations. A 5/7 of 4 is built on the 1st scale degree, but has a raised 3rd alteration. You'll notice the 5/7 of 2 diminished is all darkened out, and the reason for this is because when we tonicize chords, we will never tonicize a diminished chord. Just like we cannot tonicize a diminished key area. There's no such thing as a diminished key. There's either a major key or a minor key. Let's make a quick comparison of diatonic chords and how they relate to secondary dominants. Here in C major, we can see we're using a 2/7 chord, a diatonic 7th. This is what it sounds like. But what if we changed it into a dominant 7th by making that an F sharp? Now we have that 4-3 and the 7-1 of G major, which is the 5. Hopefully you can hear how much stronger of a pull that is. Here we have a 1 to a 4 progression. What if we change that 1 chord into a 5/7 of 4 by making it a dominant 7th? Now we've created those tendency tones. Here's what that sounds like. That dominant 7th chord clearly makes it a stronger progression. Here's another diatonic progression with a 3 going to a 6. Let's try tonicizing that 6 chord by changing the 3 into a dominant chord. Notice that we now have the 7-1 tendency tone, but because we made it a triad and not a dominant 7th chord, we lack the 4 going to 3, but it's still strong. Let's take a look at one more. Here's a progression with a diatonic 6 going to a 2. We can make this a 5 of 2 by simply adding the C sharp and making it a major chord. And now we've created that tendency tone. So to identify what we call secondary dominants, you have to first find those accidentals, the telltale signs, the clues, if you will, that something's happening, that you're being led somewhere in the music. And once you find those accidentals, see if they make a major chord, or better yet, a dominant 7th sonority. We know that the dominant 7th only occurs on the dominant. So it makes sense that if you find a dominant harmony, it's going to be tonicizing another chord. So to find that chord, you simply go down a perfect fifth from the root of the dominant seventh. Major triads are a little bit harder because we find major triads in many different places. But if we find a major triad with an accidental that does not belong to that key, there's a good chance that that chord is functioning like a dominant. And again, to find the tonicized chord, simply go down a perfect fifth from the root. Before we get into writing secondary dominants, let's look at how composers over time have used the 5 or the 5/7 of a different key area to lend tonal weight, a temporary tonal weight to another chord. Our first example is an excerpt from Schubert's Symphony No. 8, the famous unfinished symphony. And this is the first movement beginning in measure 42. Now this excerpt is in G major, even though the key signature seems to say otherwise. So when we're on a hunt for accidentals, be careful because this C natural and this C natural are part of G major. They're diatonic. But this G sharp over here is not. So let's analyze this chord. Here we have an E, we have a G sharp, we have a B, and lastly, a D. This is an E dominant 7th chord. Working on the premise that dominant 7th chords tonicize other chords, let's look at what this might be. To figure that out, we go down a perfect fifth from the root of that dominant 7th, and that is the chord that we're tonicizing. Down a perfect fifth is the note A, which is the 2. This 2 chord happens in this measure right here. Let's listen to this excerpt. Now let's turn to a work by the composer Frédéric Chopin. This piano piece is in G minor, and we might be noticing all of these F sharps in the score. But remember, in minor keys, the F sharp is the leading tone, so it's supposed to be there. It's already part of the 5 chord. However, this E natural right here is not diatonic, it's chromatic. So let's see if we can build a major chord or a dominant 7th chord with the notes in this section. At the very bottom we have the note A, then we have a C sharp, an E, and a G. Well, that's a dominant 7th chord built on A. So to find out what we're tonicizing, we will go down a perfect fifth. A perfect fifth down from A is D. Well, that's the 5 chord in G minor. So we can say that this is a 5/7 of 5 going to 5. Let's hear this excerpt and listen carefully for this section. Note what makes this progression strong is that tendency tone of the C sharp going to D, the leading tone to the 5 chord. You know, it's not just classical music that uses secondary dominants. Here's a famous song by the Eagles, Desperado. Note that we're in the key of G major, and we find in the very first measure an accidental that is chromatic. In order to see if it's a secondary dominant, we should be able to build a major triad or a dominant 7th. Here's a G, here's a B, there's a D and F natural. And that is a G dominant 7th chord. So again, to figure out what chord we're tonicizing, we go down a perfect fifth to the note C, which is the 4 chord. So this is a 5-7 of 4 going to 4. And just like with all 5-7s, we should see that 4 to 3 scale degree tendency tone. Let's listen. For the last part of our lecture today, let's focus on how we might be able to write some of these chords if we wanted to. It's really a reversal of the process we just did. If you know the chord you're tonicizing, go up a perfect fifth from that chord. Then you construct the triad by adding notes. Now we're not done yet. We need to add accidentals, those chromatic accidentals, to make it major. Because right now it's just a 2 chord in the key of C. To make it a 5 of 5, we need to make it a major chord and add that F sharp. Let's take a look at another example. If you want to tonicize the 6th chord in D major with a 5-7 of 6, in order to find the dominant 7th of that chord, we go up a perfect fifth. A perfect fifth above the note B is F sharp. And now we construct the 7th chord by adding notes. And lastly, don't forget the final step. Add accidentals to make it a dominant 7th quality. So you can see that spelling dominant 7ths is an important skill. Now it's your turn. I'm going to give you a chord that we want to tonicize, the 4 chord in C minor. Your job is to build the dominant 7th. Push pause until you have the answer, and then push play. Hopefully you got the right answer. Let's go through it. A perfect fifth up from the chord you want to tonicize would be C. Then you build or construct the 7th chord, and then the final step, make it a dominant 7th, which means we need to add an E natural. We've been on quite the journey in today's lesson. We've looked at dominant 7th chords, we've listened to a lot of great music, we've written dominant 7th chords, and there's so much about this world of chromatic harmony, and that's really what we're talking about here. Notes that are not part of the scale are called chromatic, and these notes give us the ability to move into different key areas. So it's an exciting new universe of possibilities for writing and analyzing our music. But we'll have to save that for another time because our time together, unfortunately, is over. And this is Dr. Sander, as always, reminding you to keep it simple.